She told them on the first morning out of Independence, Missouri, before the dust had even settled on the road, before anyone had learned anyone else's name. The wagon master, a thick-necked man named Garrett Owens, who had made this crossing 4 times and had stopped being impressed by anything, had been collecting information, who had family waiting, who had a land claim staked, who was traveling on hope alone. He went wagon to wagon with a ledger and asked his questions in the same flat, efficient tone a man uses when he is tallying livestock. When he reached Margaret Caldwell's wagon, the small one, the one with the mismatched oxen, the one every experienced eye on that train had already noted as a potential liability, he looked her over the way men looked over things they expected to be problems. "And you, Mrs. Caldwell, what's waiting for you in Oregon?" She was 31 years old, a widow. She had dark hair going gray at the temples that she did not try to hide. She had hands that had already done more work than most women her age, and a face that had stopped pretending things were simpler than they were sometime in the middle of her 20s. She looked at Garrett Owens without flinching and said, "A husband." He wrote it down without looking up. Someone nearby laughed. Just a small sound, not quite hidden. Mrs. Agnes Corwin, from the wagon 2 spaces behind, who was traveling with her husband and 3 children and an opinion about everything. Margaret heard the laugh. She did not acknowledge it. What she did not say, what she could not have said to Garrett Owens or Agnes Corwin or anyone else standing in that morning dust in Independence, Missouri, on May 3, 1857, was that she had never met the man, that she knew him only through 8 months of letters, carefully folded and reread until the paper went soft at the creases, that his name was Thomas Hale, that he had 160 acres in the Willamette Valley already broken and beginning to produce, and that he had written to her in January with a proposal so plainly and honestly worded that she had sat down and cried for 20 minutes before she wrote back to say yes. She did not say any of this because she had learned, in the years since her first husband died, that people's doubts were their own business and not worth feeding. She said she had a husband waiting in Oregon, and she believed it absolutely. What happened between Independence and South Pass is what this story is about. The Caldwell wagon was small because Margaret had made it small deliberately. Her father had wanted her to travel with more provisions, more furniture, the rocking chair that had been her mother's, the spinning wheel she hadn't used in 3 years. "You'll want those things when you get there," he said, meaning you'll need the comfort of the past because the future is uncertain. Margaret had packed 4 trunks, a cast-iron Dutch oven, enough flour and salt pork and dried beans for the crossing, 2 changes of clothing, a good wool blanket, and a small wooden box that held Thomas Hale's letters tied with kitchen string. Everything else she sold or left behind. Her father watched her do it with the expression of a man watching someone make a mistake too large to stop. She kissed him on the cheek at the Missouri River and did not look back until the ferry was well into the current, and by then the bank was far enough away that she could pretend she hadn't cried. The Platte River Road in early May was not the brutal, bone-dry corridor it would become by July. There was still green along the banks, cottonwood trees throwing pale new shade, and the air smelled of river mud and possibility. Margaret walked beside her wagon most mornings. The oxen, she had named them after nothing, on purpose, because she had been told not to get attached, moved at their steady, unimpressive pace, and she matched it. She noticed the man named Eli Marsh on the 3rd day, not because he sought her out, but because he did not. Most of the single men on the train had already begun the business of introduction that was really the business of assessment. She had been widowed young enough and was not so far into middle age that she was invisible to men looking. She had received 3 conversations that week that were really something else dressed up in small talk. Eli Marsh walked beside his own wagon, also small, also efficient, and spoke when spoken to and not otherwise. He was perhaps 35, dark-eyed, with the kind of quiet that came from comfort in one's own company rather than from having nothing to say. She noticed this distinction because she recognized it. She had cultivated the same quality herself. They did not speak until the 4th day, when one of her oxen stumbled on a rut crossing a dry creek bed, and Margaret found herself in front of a near-tipped wagon with no one nearby to help set it right. Eli was there before she could shout for anyone. He put his shoulder to the wagon without being asked and said only, "Push when I lift," and she did. The wagon settled back onto all four wheels. He checked the axle with his hands, the way someone checks who has repaired axles before and knows what failure feels like before it announces itself. "It'll hold," he said, "but you'll want to watch it at crossings." "I know," she said. He looked at her once. Not the assessing look she had grown used to, but a different kind. The kind that says, "I believe you." Then he went back to his wagon. By Chimney Rock, that great improbable column of pale stone rising 300 feet from the Nebraska plain, which the emigrants had been watching grow larger for 2 days, the train had settled into its own rhythms and its own politics. Agnes Corwin had determined by this point that Margaret Caldwell was a fool and a romantic and probably going to be someone else's problem before the trip was through. She said this to her husband, who made the sound of a man who has learned not to disagree with his wife on anything that doesn't directly threaten the livestock. Agnes said it to the other women at the communal fires at night. "Writing letters to a man she's never laid eyes on," Agnes said. "He's probably got a wife already, or he's dead, or he's nothing like what he wrote." The women around the fire varied in their responses. Some agreed, some reserved judgment. One woman, a young mother named Clara Brandt, 23, with a baby on her hip and a husband who slept loudly, said quietly that she thought it sounded brave. Agnes Corwin looked at Clara the way experienced women sometimes look at young women who say things like that. "Brave," she said, "is what we call foolish when it works out." Margaret heard none of this directly. She heard enough. June 12th was the date she noted in the small journal she kept tucked in the same box as Thomas's letters. They were approaching Fort Laramie, still 2 days east, and the trail had begun to change. The grass was thinner, the land was opening up into something vast and indifferent that had nothing to do with Ohio. She wrote, "The country here makes a person feel the size they actually are. I do not find this discouraging. I am not sure yet what I find it." She reread Thomas's most recent letter that night, the one he had written in February after she sent her acceptance. He had described his land in specific terms: the creek that ran along the north edge, the slope that caught morning sun, the way the soil crumbled in his hand with the particular looseness of good ground. He wrote that he was building a second room onto the house before she arrived, because he wanted her to have a place that was hers before it was theirs. She had read that sentence perhaps 30 times. A place that was hers before it was theirs. She slept with the letter still in her hand. Fort Laramie stood at the confluence of the Laramie and North Platte rivers, a low sprawl of adobe and timber that smelled of horses and smoke and the particular exhaustion that accumulates in a place where everyone passing through is already worn down. They arrived on June 14th, a Wednesday, in a dust that had been building since morning. There were letters waiting at Fort Laramie. This was not unusual. The mail that ran alongside the trail was unreliable in both directions, and emigrants received news here that could be weeks or months old by the time it found them. News of deaths and births and decisions already made and regretted. Margaret received a letter. It was not from Thomas. It was from Thomas's neighbor, a man named Aldrich, and it was dated March 19th. She knew from the weight of it before she broke the seal that it was not carrying good news. Letters with good news do not have that specific gravity. Thomas Hale had died in February. A fever, quick and merciless, the way fevers were. He had been ill for 12 days and then gone. Aldrich wrote that he was sorry, that Mr. Hale had spoken well of her in his final days, that the land was now in a question of estate. Margaret read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and placed it in the box with Thomas's other letters, and she sat in the wagon in the Fort Laramie dust with the canvas flap closed and was very still for a long time. She told no one. This is the thing about Margaret Caldwell that matters, that explains everything that came after. She told no one what was in that letter. Not that night, not the next morning, not when Agnes Corwin asked with studied casualness if she'd had news from Oregon. "Nothing that changes my plans," Margaret said, which was, in its own way, the truth. The train pushed on. South Pass was still 300 miles ahead, through Red Buttes, through the Sweetwater River country, through the long dry emptiness that ground the weaker wagons and weaker spirits down until they had nothing left to spend. The elevation was climbing. The oxen were thinning. The cold came earlier each evening and left later each morning, even in late June. The Sweetwater River country was a particular kind of hard. The road here crossed the river 7 times in 30 miles, and each crossing was cold and uncertain, the water coming off the high country to the west still carrying the memory of snowmelt. The mud at the banks was not the dark, rich mud of the Missouri lowlands, but something paler and more treacherous. A mud that looked solid and gave way to the ankle and then the knee and sometimes took a wagon wheel to the axle before releasing it. It was on the 5th Sweetwater crossing that Eli Marsh repaired her axle properly, after it finally gave way as she had feared it might. He had brought the right tools. He did not make her feel the burden of it. He worked in silence while she managed the oxen, and the conversation, such as it was, happened only in the occasional instruction and the occasional confirmation that she had followed it. When it was done, she said, "What do I owe you?" He looked at her with that same look from the dry creek bed, the believing look. "Nothing," he said. "I don't accept charity." "It isn't charity," he said. "It's neighboring. You'd have done the same." She thought about this. "I would," she said, and meant it. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible, the kind of expression a person makes when they are surprised by being understood correctly. She did not think about it again. Not consciously. South Pass arrived on July 3, 1857. She noted the date. She noted the elevation. The sign that the wagon master had posted, hand-lettered on a board, read, "Summit, South Pass. Elevation 7,412 ft, Continental Divide." She noted the specific quality of the light at that altitude, which was not brighter but cleaner, as though the air had less of everything in it, including obstruction. The wind at South Pass had an edge that the valley wind lacked. It came from the west and smelled, or she imagined it smelled, of pine forests not yet visible, of mountains still to cross, of somewhere that was not this open, bone-pale country that had become her entire world. The train stopped for midday rest. The animals needed it. The people needed it more. Margaret walked away from the wagons, not far, 50 yards, enough, and stood on that high bare ground and looked west. Behind her, nearly 1,000 miles. Ahead, more than 1,000 still. She took Thomas Hale's letters from the box. All 8 of them. She did not read them. She held them for a moment, feeling their particular weight, not heavier than paper, but freighted with what she had carried them through. The river mud, the dust, the cold nights, the small grief she had maintained in silence for 3 weeks. She did not burn them. She placed them carefully in the crook of a rock, held down by a smaller stone where they would not blow away, and she stood for a moment longer, and then she walked back to the wagons. She did not cry. She had already done that, privately, in the wagon on a night when the sounds of the camp covered whatever sounds she made. That part was finished. What she understood, standing on that divide, was something she could not have explained to Agnes Corwin or anyone else who had not walked 900 miles on an act of faith. She had not come this far because of Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale was the reason she had started, the address on the letter, the specific destination. But something else had kept her walking, something that had to do with the land, with the light at South Pass, with the way her own feet had carried her further than anyone, including herself, had believed they could. She had a husband waiting in Oregon. She still believed this. She had simply let go of the name she had attached to the belief. The false resolution, if there was one, came 2 days past South Pass. A rider came east along the trail, a young man carrying mail back from the settlements, and among the letters he distributed was one addressed to Margaret Caldwell. It was from Aldrich again, the neighbor, written a month after the first letter. He wrote that Thomas Hale's land was unclaimed and would be sold in the fall, and that if she were still intending to come to Oregon, there was another man in the valley, a decent man, a church-going man, who might be willing to consider a correspondence. Agnes Corwin was standing nearby when Margaret read this, and Agnes, who had an instinct for other people's letters, asked with wide eyes if it was good news. "Possibly," Margaret said. "I'm still thinking." She folded that letter and put it in the fire that evening, because she was not interested in a decent church-going man hand-selected by someone who didn't know her. She was not interested in starting the correspondence over. She was not interested in Oregon as a destination for a transaction. She was interested in Oregon, in the land she had been dreaming about for 8 months, in the particular creek and the morning slope and the soil that crumbled right in a man's hand. She had put all of that onto Thomas Hale, and Thomas Hale was gone. But the land was still there, and something else was still there. Something she had not fully named yet. They lost a wagon on the Snake River crossing in Idaho, not Margaret's wagon. The Branson family, 2 adults, 1 child, who misjudged the current at the ford near Fort Boise and were pulled sideways before anyone could do much about it. The wagon went. The family survived, swimming to the bank, gasping, losing everything they had packed. The child, a boy of 4, was pulled from the water by Eli Marsh, who had gone in after him without removing his boots, without a word of announcement, who came up out of the Snake River holding the boy against his chest and walked him to the bank and handed him to his mother, and then went back in to help recover what provisions could be salvaged. Margaret watched this from the eastern bank where she had already crossed. She watched Eli Marsh go into that cold brown current twice and come out twice, and she felt something settle in her chest with a soft and definite weight, like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten she was carrying. She had felt this before. Once, a long time ago, with her first husband, before she knew what marriage was, the feeling of seeing someone do a thing and understanding, without deciding, that you were going to love them. She had not expected to feel it again. She was not sure she had wanted to. Wanting required an exposure she had been careful to avoid since the fever took James Caldwell in the autumn of 1852 and left her with nothing but his name and the farm she couldn't keep and a silence in the house that was shaped exactly like a person. Eli Marsh dried off eventually when the camp was made. He sat by the fire and accepted the bowl of soup Clara Brandt pressed on him with the silent authority of a mother whose child has been fished from a river. He looked up once, across the fire, and found Margaret's eyes without seeming to search for them, as though he had known where she was sitting. He looked away. She looked away. Neither of them said anything. The Blue Mountains came on like a wall. She had been warned about them. Everyone was warned about the Blue Mountains, but warnings for things you haven't experienced are only words, and the Blue Mountains in August were not words. They were a physical argument against continuing. A steep and rocky and relentless series of ascents that turned the oxen's legs to jelly and the wagon wheels to hazards and everyone's certainty into something more qualified. The pines here were enormous and old in a way the plains trees were not, and the smell of them was different, darker and resinous, the smell of a country that had not been waiting for anyone. Her oxen made it, barely. On the descent, the 4th day in the mountains, the grade so steep that the rear wheels had to be chained to slow the wagons, the animals straining backward against gravity, Margaret's wagon began to slip. She did everything she had been told to do. She applied the brake, she called to the oxen. She was not panicking, exactly, but she was aware of the specific sound the wagon made when the chained wheels began to drag sideways, and she was aware that the drop to her right was not theoretical. Eli came alongside her on foot, appeared from somewhere above on the trail, grabbed the nearest trace chain, and pulled with everything he had. 2 other men came from the other direction. The wagon slowed and straightened and completed the descent without killing anyone. When it was over, when they were on flat ground and the oxen were blowing hard and her hands had stopped shaking enough to release the brake, she sat on the wagon tongue and looked at the ground for a long moment. Eli sat down near her. Not beside her, near her. Near enough. "You handled that," he said. "We handled that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard you have someone waiting in Oregon." She considered this. She considered who had told him, and how long ago, and what she wanted to say now. She thought about Thomas Hale and his letter about the morning slope and the soil that crumbled right. She thought about the letters she had left in the rock at South Pass. "I did," she said. "He died in February." Eli said nothing immediately. She had learned by now that his silences were not absence. They were the sound of him considering what was actually true, rather than what was merely available to say. "I'm sorry," he said, finally. "I am too," she said. He seemed like a good man from his letters. Another pause. "You kept going," Eli said. "Yes." "After you found out?" "Yes." He looked at her. The direct, believing look. "Why?" he asked. She thought about it. Really thought about it, the way the question deserved. She thought about South Pass and the letters in the rock and the specific weight of things she had put down so she could keep walking. "Because I wasn't going there for him," she said. "I was going there for me. He was just the first reason I found to start." Eli Marsh looked away, toward the west, toward whatever remained of this journey. The pines around them in the blue mountains were enormous and still, and the light came through them at the angle that the late afternoon sun makes when it has finished being overhead and is beginning, gradually, to give the world back to itself. "I have 120 acres near the Willamette," he said. "I've been trying to work it alone for 2 seasons." Margaret did not say anything. "The soil's good," he said. "Creek runs along the north edge." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm telling you this," he said, "because you said you were going to Oregon for yourself. Not because of anyone. And I want to make sure you know, I'm not a reason. I'm not trying to be. I'm just telling you there's land." She almost smiled. "And you're telling me this now?" she said. 300 miles from Oregon City, after 2,000 miles of not telling me anything? "I didn't know you then," he said. "You didn't know me in Nebraska? Not like I know you now." The fire that Clara Brandt had started nearby put its smell into the air. Wood smoke and pine pitch and the particular smell of exhausted people settling in for the night. Somewhere close, someone was singing, very quietly, a hymn in a key slightly lower than it was meant to be sung. "I'll think about it," Margaret said. "That's all I'm asking," Eli said. They reached Oregon City on September 4, 1857, a Thursday, 4 months and 1 day out of Independence, Missouri. Margaret Caldwell stood on the south bank of the Willamette River and looked at the green valley. Green in a way she had not seen since Ohio, but different, deeper, wetter, more alive than anything she remembered, and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. Not triumph exactly, not relief. Something quieter than either. Something that had no name because it was too particular to her, too specific to the exact shape of what she had survived to get here. She had walked 2,170 miles. She had crossed the Platte River and the Sweetwater and the Snake and passed over South Pass at 7,412 feet and come through the Blue Mountains in August, and she had arrived on her own feet with her wagon and her Dutch oven and her box that now held only the journal. Agnes Corwin found her on the bank and said, with a face that held something complicated between reproach and admiration, "I heard what happened. About the man in Oregon. He died," Margaret said simply, "and you still came." "I told you I had a husband waiting in Oregon," Margaret said. "I was right. I just didn't know his name yet when I said it." Agnes Corwin looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she would never quite repeat to anyone, and then she turned and went back to her family. She married Eli Marsh in October, 6 weeks after arriving, in a small ceremony in a borrowed church in Oregon City. Clara Brandt stood up with her. The preacher was a young man recently arrived from Illinois who said the words quickly because 3 other couples were waiting. She wore her traveling dress, the green one with the lace at the collar, because she had not brought another. Eli had in fact 120 acres near the Willamette, with a creek along the north edge and a slope that caught the morning sun and soil that crumbled with the particular looseness of ground that had never been mistreated. He did not build her a second room before she arrived, because he hadn't known to. He built it after, that winter, working when the light allowed, and when it was finished, he told her it was hers before it was theirs, without knowing that was what someone else had once promised her. She did not tell him. Some things are private. Some things you carry because they are yours to carry, not because they are heavy. She wrote in her journal that evening, the last entry of the crossing, "I said I had a husband waiting in Oregon. I was right. He was waiting without knowing what he was waiting for, the same as I was. 2,000 miles to find the person who was looking for the same country I was looking for. There are worse ways to find someone. There are longer ways. I cannot think of one that would have told me more about him, or about myself. She put the journal in the box where the letters had been. She set it on the shelf that Eli had built along the west wall of the room that was hers before it was theirs. Outside, the Willamette Valley was going dark in the way of October. Slowly, gently, the light spending itself down through the trees until there was only the fire and the window and the smell of wood smoke and the particular quiet of a place that had become, without announcement, home.